Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's class and NISTH Distinguished Lecture. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, who doesn't actually need a whole lot of introduction, especially to the NTU community, because Helga is, of course, our own Nanyang professor, visiting professor, and she's been coming to NTU fairly regularly, twice a year at least, giving us a lot of advice and help and assistance and lectures, of course. So let me just nevertheless introduce Helga to those of you who may be less familiar. Professor Helga Nowotny is Professor Emerita of Science and Technology Studies at ETH Zurich and a founding member of the European Research Council. In 2007, she was elected ERC Vice President, and from March 2010 until December 2013, she was President of the ERC. Currently, she's Chair of the ERC Council Forum Austria, member of the Austrian Council and Vice President of the Council for the Lindau Nobel Laureate Meetings. She's also visiting professor, of course, at NTU, as I mentioned at the beginning. Among her other appointments, she's foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and continues to serve on many international advisory boards in Austria and Europe and beyond. She has published widely in science and technology studies and on social time. This is one of her very keen topics. Throughout her professional career, Helga has been engaged in science and innovation policy matters and continues to serve as an advisor at national and EU levels. Helga has published a lot of articles, more than 300 articles in scientific journals, and also quite a few books. I'm having a hard time catching up with the books. Her latest book, which I hope will come up in an English version, but this is her German book now, which I am not sure exactly how one should translate it, but my understanding of it is that it's about time, and algorithmic time.
No, this has been translated.
Yeah.
Has been translated.
Oh, that's the one, yeah. Okay. So that's the social time book. But also she's written several other books, including The Cunning of Uncertainty was the previous one that was featured by the Financial Times in the list, on the list as one of the best books of 2015. Other books include Naked Genes and Insatiable Curiosity and Cultures of Technology and the Quest for Innovation, etc. So before I invite Helga to give us the lecture today, I just want to thank her on behalf of the NTU community, not only for her visits and her lectures, which, by the way, she writes new lectures for us every time. And I'm very grateful for that. But also, she's been spending a lot of time giving advice to our grant writers. So if you happen to be preparing a major grant, or even not so major, and you need a pair of sharp eyes and very good experience with research grant proposals and so on, do let us know. We can try and arrange a meeting with you. She's also meeting our postdoctoral fellows and giving them advice for the research and teaching. And so we are really very pleased to welcome Helga with us again this week and next, and to give one of, I think, 3 lectures this time, the first of the 3 lectures on the very topical and important theme of digital future. How human will it be? Helga. Thank you.
嗯。
Thank you very much, KK. With this advertisement to come and talk to me about your research, I know you will keep me very busy next time I come. But I very much enjoy interacting with the junior faculty, and I try to give you whatever advice I can give you. So today, it's my pleasure to take you through what is a very big question. And with big questions, you cannot expect simple answers. So I hope you came today without expecting me to give you a simple answer. But I will try to take you through what I think there's general agreement today that we find ourselves in the midst of a major scientific, technological, societal transformation. And while we each have some take on it, nobody really knows what the future is going to be. And we are partly prepared, partly not prepared. Of course, we can always look back in history, and we can ask ourselves, as the name, the fourth industrial revolution indicates, if we are now in number 4, so where's number 3, 2, and 1? So we can go back in history, whether they have numbers or not, to single out other major transformations. But then the question arises, is what we are going through now, is this unprecedented? The answer is yes and no. It's unprecedented because we find ourselves at one point, one phase in our general evolution as a species. We can say that cultural evolution, in particular science and technology, has overtaken our biological evolution. We are now able to fabricate all these artificial things, algorithms and the like, that in evolution we were not yet able to do. So from this point of view, yes, we are in a unique situation. But on the other hand, if you go back and you do a historical analysis, you will find there are certain similarities. Of course, never the same. As we know, the past is a strange country, and they do things differently there. And while historians can draw parallels, can alert us there are certain features that do not change, we can never relive the experience of people. And the projections and hopes, anxieties and fears differ in time, so we cannot say we are more anxious or less anxious than people who went through other major transformations in history. And this we have to take into account. But I would also like to introduce a little bit of science technology studies perspective here and the history of technology, which is part of it. And there, the major message is whatever happens, it's never technology alone. There's one famous book in the 80s by a historian of technology. His name was Langton Winner. And what stuck from the book he wrote was one phrase in particular, and the phrase was, "Artifacts have politics." And what he meant by that is, whatever technology you look at, it is embedded in social relations. There are power relations that form part of it, how technology is developed, how it's deployed and used, etc. And the example that Langton Winner gave was the building of one of the major highways from New York City way back in the 20s and 30s, going out to Long Island beaches. And it was meant from the city administration as one way of enabling also the disadvantaged and lower socioeconomic strata population to enjoy in the hot and humid summers of New York, without little air condition at that time, to enjoy Long Island beaches. Now, what the engineer of these highways did, and he did it, as we now know, deliberately, was he built the bridges across the highway at a height so that the buses that were supposed to bring the poorer people out to the beaches could not pass under. And this is what Langton Winner meant with artifacts have politics. So you have a construction, the political administrative intention was there, yet the architect, just lowered a little bit the specifications so the buses could not go through. So this is one example of many, but I hope you will remember it. Artifacts do have politics, they do have social relations, and this is what STS tries to unravel. Another book, also going back to the 80s, is another historian of technology, Tom Hughes, and he worked on large systems. He worked on electricity, how the electricity system was built up, and as always in the development of technology, and I think this is relevant for today, and this is why I'm telling you this, there are more options than one. There is no technological determinism. When we look back, we always see there were some points in time where technology could have gone one way or it could have gone another way. And historians, of course, you have to specify what were the conditions that made it go in one way or another way, just as we see now with the electric car. Unless you have an infrastructure where you can plug in your electric car, it's not going to go very fast until you have solved this problem. Or if you take batteries, we know there's a bottleneck very often in the development of technological systems. So you have to be aware of this. But the main point, again, of someone like Tom Hughes was, look at it as a system. It's never the technology alone. It's connected with finance. It's connected with what are the options in a particular society at a particular time. And if we think about the digital future today, some of us may want to look at, in terms of research, what does it do to us on the micro level? How does it change our lives? Others want to look at it from a systems level. How does it change the system, for instance, healthcare system, etc. All these are legitimate questions, but in both cases or in other cases, don't forget it's never technology alone. So one of the, and why it is important that in my title it says digital future. The point here is the future is unknown. So if we speak and think about the future, the digital future, no one here in the room nor anywhere else can really say what's going to come, because the future, by definition, is uncertain. And this is why I will turn towards the imagination. How do we imagine our digital future? Now, there are other ways of dealing with the digital future, and I'm not going to go into them, but I want to mention them. And this is what many of your other students and researchers on this campus in other places do. They look at the technological developments. They see what is actually going on. For instance, energy needs for blockchain systems. Everyone speaks about blockchain as being one of the key technologies of the future. Yet, we have a little problem, and that's it will use a lot of energy. So where is this energy coming from? It's part of the question of our digital future. If you look at the infrastructure, we are now speaking about 4G grids, etc. Again, where will these infrastructures be built? How will they cover the needs also of people who live in more distant places, etc., etc. So these are ways of dealing with the digital future with a kind of, if you want, hands-on way, but there are problems to be solved. And one problem that is touching you very much here in Singapore is, and you are working on it, is the future of cities, but conceiving of the future of cities as a digital city. This means you're using, or you want to use, the full potential that this technology has, not just in connecting people, but in connecting through sensors, you know, how you deal with your with heat in Singapore, you know, how to cool it down, and how can you use this kind of technology to do that. But again, I would say, you know, with this hands-on questions that people are dealing with, they still have some kind of imagination of what this digital future should be. And this digital imagination comes from our collective imaginary, because we all have different ideas, individually and collectively, about the digital future. And where do these ideas, these imaginary images that we have, where do they come from? Now, the sources are pretty obvious. We are influenced by the media that surround us. Advertisement. Advertisement has an enormous influence on us, even if we don't recognize it, because we are not looking at advertisements as something, we see them, they want to sell us something. But we don't see the subtle cues that come in advertisement influencing our imagination, and where the advertisement or the people who commission an ad would like us to go, and how to think and how to see the world. Another important source are, of course, films, literature, stories you read, science fiction, or what Margaret Atwood called speculative fiction. So all this is part of a huge pool of different kinds of media that surround us, that feed into these collective and individual imaginations. And they shape our ideas of what the digital future might be. So we have this huge repertoire. It's very difficult to pin it down, because these are fleeting images, they are ideas, and to make it more concrete is indeed very, very difficult. But I hope to show you then later, you know, one example of how this is done. So we have this huge repertoire that represents ideas that we have of something that is not yet here. Because remember, we are thinking and imagining something that does not exist as yet, namely our future. So let me start, whether you call it science fiction. This is a film that probably some of you have seen, Ex Machina. You know the film, most of you? So I will not say much about the film, but I would like you to focus on what this character does. She, and we identify her as a woman, she looks into a mirror. Very ordinary thing, but it's a digital mirror. And a digital mirror does not just reflect like an ordinary mirror, something that we recognize as us. There is a double mirror. It's a double mirror because there is a digital mirror behind it that collects the data of your face, that collects in, you know, science fiction can go in all directions, your thoughts, etc., etc. So there is this double mirror that she's actually looking in. And what you see in such a mirror is perhaps what you want to see, perhaps what you expect to see, but in any case, it has something to do with yourself, and it has something to do with one of the oldest questions of humanity, namely the question, who am I? And if you remember Socrates, the philosopher, what we think of being his major philosophical contribution more than 2,000 years ago for us today is still valid today. Namely, he said, know thyself, know yourself. And this question, who am I, is one that continues to drive us when we think and look at the way how this imagination develops. Now, why are we so anxious about our identity? Why do we feel this uncanniness when we meet a robot that looks like us, when we are surrounded by a digital environment where some people have the fear, now they know all this, the algorithms knows what I've been doing in the past, they know what I've been looking at, with whom I have been going out, you know, they know more than myself about me. So there's a deep-seated anxiety that has to do with our sense of identity. And again, I would say this is, even if the form is new, as such, it's nothing new. And these are the two examples here on the right and left are just examples from a vast amount of anthropological and historical and literary literature and stories of all humankind, where there was always this anxiety. If you look at what anthropologists have written about legends and stories, very often the world is populated, and it was populated for them in those times, by ghosts, by demons, by animals that were able to change shape and form. So it would be a tiger, but it could also turn itself into a human. And so all these stories touch upon the question of identity. How can I be sure that it is me and I'm not a ghost and I'm not being transformed into an animal? So these are full of stories. And the book in the middle is something that brings us up to the digital future. Ian McEwan is a very good British writer. And Machines Like Me, I just want to tell you very briefly one episode in this book. It's a very well and beautifully written book about a moment of intimacy. So the main character has a love affair with a beautiful woman who in the book happens to be Asian. So there's also the exoticism of Asian woman that is captured in the book. But this happens in a time where there is a society with one major taboo. There's one question that you're not allowed to ask, namely, are you real? So the main character does not know. Is this woman whom he finds wonderful, sensual? He has emotions towards her, but he does not know, is she real or has she been made in, of all places, Düsseldorf? You don't know where Düsseldorf is, but those Europeans, you know, it's a very mediocre German town. And in the book, you know, the question is, has she been made in Düsseldorf? And this would mean she's a robot, and he would not like her to be a robot, but then he goes on thinking, well, maybe I should like her as a robot, etc. But in the end, he dares to ask the question. So I will not tell you more about it, but it's just to illustrate, you know, we go from the most ancient myths of transformation of people into animals, because it was an animal world in which people were living. And now we live in a machine world. So it's not the animal anymore, it's the machine that starts to take the place that the animals occupied, or the ghosts occupied in these former stories. Now, why is this human identity so precarious? Partly it is because we are born into a social world where our identity is shaped by those around us. It starts with the parents, mother, father, speaking to the child, giving physical contact, emotional warmth to the child. That is very much a part of forming an identity. But then comes the age when the person wants to emancipate him or herself from the parents. Part in life when adolescents become rebellious, they want to be different from their parents, and they are grappling very hard forming their own identity, which differs from what their parents wanted them to be in some respects. They are trying to emulate the peers they admire, but at the same time, they have to find their own identity. So this is why this period of adolescence is such a vulnerable period. Also is connected to what happens in your brain in that time, because there's a kind of rewiring taking place and all kinds of hormonal upsettings that occur during that period. It's a very vulnerable period, and this is why it is so important when we think about the digital future to realize that this is probably the most precarious part of future generations interacting with social media. We know about online harassment, how much youngsters suffer from not being recognized by their peers, how they, there were these spectacular cases of reporting suicides, a suicide and then the suicide going viral, where we know there is this tendency to emulate what others are doing and, and so on. So our social identity is very much shaped by the recognition that is given to us by others in various parts of our lives, various kinds of contributions, but this is how we become ourselves. Now, interestingly enough, the term identity comes from Latin, and the root of it is idem, which means the same. And the same means that the etymological root of identity means you were part of a group and you were the same as other members of the group. So your identity was very much a group identity. We still have a group identity, but now in addition we have this strong yearning to have ourself and our identity as we think. So let's move on from what happens inside us. I was telling you a sort of folk psychology about us becoming who we are. Let's look what happens from the outside and in these interactions with part of our digital environment that surrounds us. We are surrounded by digital gadgets of all kinds. We are partly surrounded or like to play, interact with robots, but above all, we are surrounded by the data that we leave. The tracks and traces, every interaction you do, whatever you do on your phone, it's registered somewhere, and we are all contributing in conscious and unconscious ways to this huge amount of data that keeps amassing about us and about what we will do in the future, about our habits, about our past, all of that. But slowly, we are also at a time when a part of this data is being reassembled to create something that is your data double. So there is another persona, which is a data persona, your data profile. And without going into technical details, think of it, we all have another data profile, kind of shadow person that we interact with, because the shadow is fed by what we are, like a real shadow. You know, when you move your arm, the shadow moves the arm. And yet it's not you, but it has something to do with you. And that's, again, something that builds up a tension, that makes some of us feel uneasy. And turning again to literature, in particularly the 19th century, in the Romantic period of European literature, there was a phenomenon that in German was called the Doppelganger. In other words, you know, your double. And you find, you know, it's a shadow, but then, you know, in the novel you meet a person who looks exactly like you, and you're just stunned, you know, who is this person, etc. So, and we are building up consciously and unconsciously some kind of doppelganger who is a data doppelganger. So you will never be able to shake hands with this person, but it's there. And how are we going to deal with it? And the anxiety comes in, does this data doppelganger know more about us than we? Or are we the ones who still have the ability to get out of it and to say no? So how do artists, that's the other big group that influences us in our imagination, how do they imagine our digital future? And I'm giving you one example here. I hope it works. Yes. This is called the world's first digital art museum, but let me assure you, it's definitely not the first. Because it has existed in Europe. We have several digital art museums, but it's a beautiful museum. So watch this, and you will see it gives a different impression of our digital future. It's aesthetically very pleasing, and so it's even at one point very calming, but it's about trying to put us into a collective mood, you know. It's not the anxiety, who am I, is my doppelganger behind me? It's we are fused into some kind of collectivity. So this is another way to imagine the digital future. So let me now turn towards something that has to do with how we are making futures through imaginaries today. And what is meant by that is that we are reordering the world of things. And I give you one example which is drawn from the work of my colleagues in Vienna, Ulrike Feld and Susanne Oechsner. They did a nice little study on an advertisement by a firm that works for the fashion industry. And what the fashion industry does is they make a little ad for the use of radio frequency identification tags. You all know it when you go to a store. Somewhere there is a hidden tag that should prevent you from walking out of the store without paying. That's how most of us experience it. But in reality, as you will see, you know, there are other functions to it than just stopping shoplifting. So this radio frequency identification tag, it's considered a key core technology because it's easy to install. We have the recognition of it also in supermarket products, etc., etc. And it is something that we normally don't think about. Yet this radio frequency ID is able to track movements. That's what it's meant to do. So let's have a look at it. But first, let me just give you a better definition why I call this the future-making imaginary. Now, in STS jargon, we speak a lot about socio-technical imaginaries, because it's one way for us as researchers to try to tap into, you know, how our technologies shaped not just by the technology, the hardware itself, but where does the design come in? How is the design influenced by ideas that the designers finds are of relevance, are somewhere in the society, will make your product better to sell, etc., etc. So, and this is a definition given by Sheila Jasanoff and her collaborator Kim. It's a collectively held institutionally stabilized and publicly performed vision of desirable futures, so something you want, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through advances in science and technology. You don't have to remember this, but just to tell you, people have been thinking about it and giving it a more precise feeling for it. So let's now look at this ad. And the word performing is important here. And again, in STS, we mean by performing the kind of impact something has that we do on other people, on the world around us. And this is a way of, capturing in a concept the kind of ordering work that this tag does.
Managing stock and goods can be hard work. That's why we've developed an innovative system to help you control and communicate with your goods. Into an item, preventing counterfeit. Tagged inbound goods can be effortlessly relocated to the appropriate area in the store. Similar or identical looking items are easily distinguished and suitably assigned. Time and labor-intensive inventory process can now be executed in no time.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Unexpected items are identified 12, and misplaced items can easily be located. At the point of sale, no barcode needs to be read. Items are simply identified by a sensor. Once paid for, the electronic article surveillance will no longer trigger alarms, enabling goods to leave the store. A number of leading retail chains and luxury fashion brands already use the Tingle's item-level solution to drive their business intelligently. So let us work our magic, give your customers extra time and service to accelerate your competitive advantage. Choose fashion-forward business intelligence. The Tingle.
Okay, so we are not here to judge whether this is a very good advertisement or not, but I'm sure you will agree it's a well-made one. But as STS scholars in particular, we want to ask questions. If we regard this as future-making and showing us this kind of world that is imagined, but at the same time, you're making the future, because retail and the use of these tags in retail is a huge business, and the tags can follow you wherever you go if there is the infrastructure. So one of the first observations seeing this video is we have an orderly space, and it's about ordering the world, the ordering of things, in this case, in this confined space of the shop floor. It's driven by the understandable wish to be more effective because you can find the items, you can reorder them as you saw, put them there, you can identify what is missing. And there was one part, I'm not going through the video again, but for didactic purposes, it could be done to point out exactly, you know, where you see what. But so the question to be asked is, there are two perhaps conflicting expectations that should come up in discussing such a film. And the one is, yes, there is the wish to have an ordered world. And we all agree, you know, in a shop floor, we want this order and we should help retail to do this order in an effective way. At the same time, there is the question about how to protect our privacy. Because when you leave the shop, you are leaving that particular infrastructure, which is invisible to you. You see the tag, but you don't see the infrastructure that enables the tag to function. You're going out and the tag goes with you. Outside of this shop floor, the tag is no longer activated, it has to be deactivated. But you could imagine that there are other infrastructures outside that pick up the radio signal and that allow you to follow wherever. So this is one of the questions that arises. And my colleagues in detail, they went through this short video and said, you know, there are reconfigurations that happen both in, you know, creating order, making order, but at the same time going beyond order making and bringing in the way how the humans are brought in, etc. So I'm skipping the details, but I hope that I gave you also some interest in that we can take such an advertisement. And there are methods of doing it. There's video analysis as a method that allows you to look at units of meaning. So this is a methodological question, units of meaning, and you can follow and decode what you saw here. At the same time, when I said also designers are influenced by imaginaries, you know, there's some kind of technology script where they put in some ideas of themselves, but also ideas that they have, how other users will react to it. And this is again part of the overall imaginary. And all this comes together, and this is why we call it future-making imaginaries. And some of this future is already here. Now, let me switch to some perhaps more familiar issues that you all have experienced in the general discussions about the digital transformation underway. But the question, and this is part of this discussion that we are witnessing, the future very often when something is not there as yet, but you know, partly we experience it already. The future serves as a huge projection screen where people project their hopes, their aspirations, but also their fears and anxieties. And this is why you find this typical, you know, which way to go. You find a kind of polarization. And this is very much the case for all the discussion that we have about Industry 4.0 or the future of work, as you might also call it, in the sense everyone agrees jobs will vanish, new jobs will appear, and looking at the vast literature that has come out from business school, from economists, from other disciplines, there is no consensus whatsoever. No consensus how many jobs will be lost, how many jobs will be created, and even less of no consensus, if there is such a thing, about the timeline. We don't know how quick it will happen. It depends also on the sector, it depends on the country, it depends on trade balances, etc., etc. So it's a very, very complex matter to deal with. But what we see in the discussion is, you know, in this very simplified way, finally, you know, we have a technology that will reduce even further the dehumanizing aspect, so puts it into a long line of continuation of automation of work that has been going on since a long, long time. When, you know, the US in the late 19th century was far advanced at one point compared to Europe in terms of actual use of automation, for the simple reason that being an immigrant country, they had far fewer skilled workers. So the pressure was there on the firms, on businesses, to jump to automation, while in Europe you still had a lot of skilled workers, so there was less incentive from the firm to automate. And again, you know, the history of technology is full of these examples, but there's a very long history to automation, so it's nothing new. And yet, you know, we have the feeling it comes with a pace and a speed and a lot of open questions that we don't know how to answer. Another one, again, something you're all familiar with, but again, we have which way to go. The internet and social media, the discussion how to regulate the internet, far, far away from the emancipatory dreams that the founding generation had. Now, you know, we will be able to connect everyone, we will be able to emancipate ourselves, we will live in a decentralized world. And what you see is there is, as in any complex system, you have a bit more decentralization, but at the same time you have a concentration again of power. If you think of the large corporations that not only own most of the data, but also own most of the algorithms, and it is private property and not publicly accessible. So we see again, these questions about use and misuse of data. Again, I will not go into this in greater detail. And something that I find quite interesting in this discussion that comes up is not only about the incorporating ethics into AI, because people realize that there are a lot of biases that are incorporated into the algorithm. Facial recognition, you recognize black faces as easily as white faces, etc., etc. There are many examples of that. So we know there are the biases. But and then people say, well, you know, we need to have ethic guidelines. But now people go beyond asking for ethical guidelines, and they say we have to have a technology that makes it sure it cannot be abused. Now, to what extent you can create a technology that cannot be abused is a matter for discussion. But we certainly can have a technology that is made safer against abuse. And so it's an ongoing discussion which way to go. Then, and this is a big question always, the unintended consequences of human action, the unintended consequences of any technology and its use. And here you have on the one hand something like the celebration of the fourth industrial revolution, and you have a damning account, the book by Shoshana Zuboff. She comes from, I think, the MIT Business School. She speaks about the age of surveillance capitalism, and she is very harsh in her criticism about the big firms that collect and own these data, and she says we are complicit in what is happening there. You know, we allow the firms to get our data for free. They are not treating us as clients. They are exploiting us, etc., etc. So you have again a sort of very polarized discussion going on, and I think one way to perhaps, I would not say overcome the polarization, but about one way how we can try to see where perhaps we have the greatest need in bringing technology in its digitalization form together with another big problem we face is the following. This is, can we think of new ways of bringing together digitalization and the benefits it has, but also the drawbacks it has. Every technology has benefits and drawbacks, with the problem we face with the Anthropocene. Now, those of you who are not familiar with the term Anthropocene, it goes back to a talk that Paul Crutzen, a Nobel laureate in chemistry, gave some 10 years ago or so, saying, we have now arrived at a point in human history, human development, where it is us humans shaping the physical earth and everything that is on it. So it is we, the anthropos, that shapes the earth. And then people in geology got together and they said, well, we want to make this an official designation. Now, in order for a geologist to recognize something as a new era, a new epoch, you have heard of the Cambrian. You have learned something of this in school, and it was very boring, I'm sure. So the Anthropocene, to be recognized as a new age, you have to have something, physical tracks and traces that you find in a rock, because this is what geology is about. It's about rocks, what you find in the earth. And so people are still discussing now, and something we do find of human origin that is still there in the rocks is radioactivity that is due to the first nuclear tests conducted in the 1940s of the last century. So they are discussing, you know, should this be the official beginning of this era? But what the concept is meant to convey is we live in a time where climate change, environmental degradation, the plastics in the oceans, etc. It's us humans causing this kind of problems that we are facing. And here the plea is really, can we come up with a new perspective that tries to integrate the two? Because digitalization allows us to see much closer, with much more precision, in greater detail, you know, what we are actually doing. We now are able to listen to acoustic waves in the ocean floor. We're able to map what is underneath and above us, etc. So this is perhaps, you know, one way to think how to get out of this polarization, because we indeed face the problems that are connected with the way our environment. And I mean, looking at the news, you saw what happened in the American Midwest, and it's due to this vortex that turns and swirls in the wrong way. But why does the vortex swirl in a long way? It's due to a warming of the Arctica. And the warming influences how the vortex swirls, and therefore you have this kind of abnormal phenomena that will become the new normal. So let me now to move slowly to the end. And these are really perhaps some questions to you, because we all live already in a digital environment. Part of it, you know, as I try to indicate, is the future, and we imagine the future, but part of it is here already. And the question is, are we sufficiently prepared for our digital life, our everyday life? And one of the issues here is we have both the question of what is visible to us and what is invisible to us. As I mentioned in connection with the radio frequency identification tag, you don't see the infrastructure. You just see the tag. We know, of course, there has to be an infrastructure because it's not magic. We know there are algorithms, but you don't see an algorithm. You know, you can look it up in a textbook. What does an algorithm look like? It's a formula. It's a set of rules in your software program. But you don't see it like a physical object that surrounds you. And therefore, how are we going to negotiate this constant change between something that is visible to us and that is invisible to us? This is one of the topics that I think is preoccupying us, and perhaps, you know, I'm also suggesting possible research topics to some of you who are interested in this area. And I think this is something to take a bit further. Then the social organization of communication. We have at least 3 kinds of communication in this context. We have human-machine communication. You talk to a machine or you interact. Communication also in the wider sense of interaction. You interact with a machine. You have machine-machine communication, which is growing enormously. If you look at something like the financial markets, you still see people there. But basically, the transactions in financial markets, the asset pricing, the sort of problems that people working here on the campus in something called fintech, financial technology, deal with, it is machine-machine interaction. Of course, somebody has to program it, but it's machine-machine interaction. And then we still have human-human interaction. So not everything has been overtaken by human-machine interaction, machine-machine. But we have human-human interaction. How does this fit together? So that's another perhaps interesting research site for you to think of and to look at. The future of talk and communication, you know, what does it do to language and the use of language in context? Now, some people working in sociolinguistics, you know, have looked at changes of how we speak in all languages. How has this been influenced by technology? Now, one of the earliest studies of this kind was related to the speed of talking. And what they did is to look at, in European parliaments, there was a time that most of you not only do not remember because you were not alive, but you may not even know the technology. There was something called stenography. Now, stenography was a way of abbreviating the words, and you had little signs that you wrote down. You could be trained in stenography, and so you were able to write very quickly while people, there were no tape recorders. So, and yet, you know, they wanted to have word-by-word recording of what was discussed in Parliament. So people started to look at these stenographic records. And they found, because every speech was clocked, you know, speaker so-and-so starts at 13:02, ends at 13:15, or whatever it was. So we have these empirical records, and you can see how the language was speeding up already in those days. And I'm mentioning this, you know, there are so many new methods that you can also use if you have an interesting research question. And this just is one example of many. And the way how language now, language always keeps changing, but the sentences become much shorter, and the words become abbreviated, because when you write Twitter and so on, you don't spell out the word. So there is an ongoing change here that is also of interest. How is language used in different contexts, and what does it mean? And then we have this performance of digital life, you know, the phenomenon of the selfie. And what does the selfie stand for? Why has it taken over so quickly and so pervasively? And in this connection, performance of digital life, those of you who know the work of Goffman, a sociologist, it is highly, highly relevant to what we do today in our digital world today. Goffman wrote about and worked about the performing self, but he also employed a very ingenious method to find out, what are the rules. So he would come into the class at a given time. Students would sit here, and then he would stand there and he would say nothing. And just observe what happened. So, students would look at each other, etc. Some students would get restless, etc. And then, one finally broke the silence and so on. And he used it as a very ingenious way to bring out what are the social norms, what are the expectations of your behavior when you enter a classroom, a social setting that is different from when you go to a party or when you meet in the courtroom, courtyard below, etc. So he was using this as a way to get the interaction. And also another important concept of his is social life has always a front side and a back side. And you have, as a social researcher, you have to look at both. What is the performance, in which official context, in which public context, and what is going on behind. And again, I think this is an important, if you want, methodological, lesson that we can take. So I mentioned this, as possible ways of getting you interested in thinking about it, not just listening to me tell you nice stories, but it's something that you want to do, perhaps yourself. So, what does it mean to live a digital life? I think here we are facing some problems that will preoccupy us in the years to come, especially in the field of health. Health data are extremely important, not just genomic data, but the kind of monitoring of our well-being, of the heart rate, etc., etc. But what will happen with these data? Who will have the ownership of these data? Now, some people argue, each one of us, just as you have your social health insurance number and the right to get certain services from the health system, you should also be the owner of your data, you and only you. And you can discuss it with your doctor, with the hospital, etc., but you have the ownership. But this raises the question, how prepared are we for this kind of ownership, if it happens? What do people do? Now, educated people have an advantage. You will have an advantage when you become, if it happens, the owner of your data. But what about people who don't have the educational means, the knowledge, the familiarity, or if you get your data, you cannot read what is written there. So these are some of the problems, and related to this, of course, is the digital divide. Societies, we know inequality is growing everywhere, and digitalization is likely to increase it even further. So what can be done here? Then the question of trust, which is everywhere. And what we see now is a very difficult phase in terms of social media and trust and political public life, because when you see news, is this a troll by whichever government has managed to infiltrate and target you with false news, etc. So there's this erosion of trust going on. What can be done to restore some of the trust? And I mentioned already the data double. Now, I come to the end, I started out with the digital future and our imagination of it. And I think the answer to our digital future hinges very much on how we get involved in redefining what it means human. This is another big question, of course, but let me just give you a bit of my own thinking on this. I think starting out as biological beings, we are augmenting and continue to augment our human abilities. And perhaps instead of artificial intelligence, which has this somewhat superficial way, there's intelligence, which is us somehow, and then there is something artificial. It's about augmenting intelligence, augmenting our capabilities. The first tools that the Neanderthals and the first Homo sapiens were constructing was to augment things that they could not do with their bodies, to hunt the prey, to get after the animal, to help to build the first tools, etc. So this is what technology is all about, to augment what we can do. We wear glasses because it makes us see further. So technology is inherently used and invented to augment our abilities, including, of course, our then what machines cannot do. In my view, there are many exaggerations that are circulated. I think the singularity, if it ever happens, is far, far away in the future. And somebody once said, whether machines can think is as relevant a question as whether submarines can swim. And we should not worry about artificial intelligence, but natural stupidity. So, perhaps this is something also, to take away. And of course, I think the role of the humanities and social sciences will be crucial. This is why I think we have to familiarize ourselves with the way how we interact with technology and start to develop also research-led questions and also research methods that are appropriate to the kind of questions we pose. At the end, let me give you three brief examples as a conclusion. H.G. Wells is probably familiar to you as the writer of all kinds of fiction, but he was also something of a historian. And in 1990, so 100 years ago, this was after the end of the First World War, with its disastrous consequences in Europe, but also elsewhere, he decided to write a short history of the world, and he wrote it very quickly. It's a very nice book to read because it gives you an interesting guide through history. And this is the famous sentence with which this book closes, and it sounds still relevant 100 years later. Human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe. So are we able, by education, is putting the trust into the next generation, their outlook, their values, to save us from a catastrophe that may be possible. I wrote 1 year ago, when I was here giving a lecture on a humble view from inside evolution, that we find ourselves in this co-evolution process between humans and machines. And for us it is important to navigate between hubris, arrogance, overconfidence, and humbleness on the other side. And this is how an artist sees it, and you all have seen this by now, I hope. This is the symbol by Michelangelo Pistolet that you can find here on NTU campus. It's called the Third Paradise. And what Pistoletto means by this, we came out from one circle, which was the state of nature, and we move to the other circle, which is the artificial, created by us. We have to cross all these lines and come to some kind of balance between nature and machines. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helga, for this wide-ranging and thought-provoking lecture, asking many fundamental questions and suggesting some frameworks for us to ponder these issues and possibilities. So now the floor is open for questions. Any questions?
Don't be shy.
Thank you, Professor Nowotny, for the talk. I've just a statement today before my question. It's quite interesting that digitization was, the act of digitization was first used to simplify analog signals, and now it's actually
To what?
to simplify analog signals,
Yeah.
and now it's complicating society in many ways. And my question is related to that. Neuroscientists have hypothesized that the brain processes and stores information digitally, and they seem to have results to back it up at this moment or maybe in the near future. So my question is, if we are already digital, do we need to worry so much or to be anxious about a digital future, or even a point where we are, where there's singularity happening?
Okay. Well, first of all, let's agree, neuroscience is a very difficult field, and I think every neuroscientist will agree whatever they find is very, very early, because the brain is the most complex organ on Earth, and we are just beginning to understand a bit here and there, and very far from even, there are three major international efforts, as you probably know, ongoing. One is in the US, one is in Europe, one is in China. There's a kind of race between these three scientific continents who can come and grapple with finding out more about the brain. Now, evolution has, in some ways, we are the result of tinkering of evolution. And another example would be we are very poor in probability reasoning. We can deal with natural frequencies, but most of us, unless you are very mathematical in your way of thinking, most of us have difficulties in grappling with probabilities. So why? You can say, well, in evolutionary terms, it was important to realize cause and effect, fight and flee situations in our evolutionary past. So we can relate cause and effect if it is at the same time. Once it becomes longer distance, we're getting poorer and poorer. And this is where technology and digitalization helps us again, because we are able to build simulation models, because we are able to use this to see and to see a bit further than evolution has equipped us. So my take on it would be, I'm not concerned about the singularity. I'm not worried, but I am here as a social scientist, as an STS person, to observe, to analyze, to interpret the anxieties that it causes in society. And any technology can be abused, there's no question about it, but what are the safeguards that we can and have to build into it, that the abuse will be kept at a minimum. So I don't know whether this answers your question, but findings of neuroscience, they are still very, very preliminary. And then the next finding will come slowly, slowly, you know, we will, and I think science is about making progress, but we still have a long way to go.
I'm not a neuroscientist, but ecologist.
I would also like to suggest that actually another way of looking at it is to think that, of course, you know, it may well be an hypothesis, right? That the brain works digitally, but equally, I think it's very likely that this is a metaphor rather than a hypothesis. Because we need metaphors to understand anything at all. And the brain being such a complex and little understood organ, we're trying to grapple with it by using what we do understand, which is the computer, as a metaphor for the brain. And people have used other metaphors in previous ages, depending on whatever they happen to think they understand.
That's what metaphors are good for, you know. They make you understand what you don't understand, at least a little bit.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, there's someone there, and then this.
Yeah, one question I have is what's the best research methods to study this kind of question?
The best decision makers?
No, what's the best research methods to study this kind of question? Because if I can hear you, imaginary is probably from arts, you know, you have very technical subjects there. So just looking from your own experiences, how do you develop the so-called appropriate way to study such issues?
Well, I think we have to be more inventive. You know, we tend to rely on what you're taught in your methods courses, that this is it. But this is only the result of a previous period when these methods were usually devised for previous research questions. So if you come up with new research questions, you have to ask yourself, you know, are these methods, can I adapt them? Are they functioning well to answer my question? And this is, from my experience, one of the most difficult decisions that anyone doing research has to face. You know, are my methods the right ones for the question I want to answer? And very often, perhaps it's also the fault of the way how we teach students. You know, we want to give them a kind of shelf of approved methods, and then we say, you know, you find this 4.1 or 7.2, and then everything is fine. Now, this may be good for the sort of standard research where you know, okay, now I ask the same question but in another field. Okay, but if you want to go ahead and ask new research questions, you have to think very hard, you know, can I also find new methods that help me solve it? And I gave you a few historical examples just to, you know, stimulate your curiosity and to stimulate also your boldness. You know, think about new methods, even if they don't come off the shelf. And then, of course, you have to assure that it will work. Sometimes you have to do a little study, a kind of pilot. You discuss with colleagues. You see the advantages and the drawbacks. You have to make sure, but you know, be more innovative and more daring in going beyond what you find on the shelf. If you have a new research question, if you have a conventional question, the shelf is fine and it answers your needs. But if you want to venture out, and this is what real research is about. It's about questions that have not been asked in this way before. And this is why we need you as the young generation to engage in research in this way. You know, have also the courage to think of new questions. You had a question.
What is the role that philosophy can play in shaping the digital future?
Philosophy is great in answering questions without giving answers. No, I don't, I mean seriously. It's not a facetious remark. Philosophy is good in answering questions. And you can ask all kinds of questions that make people think beyond what they take for granted. So I would say, yes, philosophy has a role to play, but don't turn to a philosopher if you want an answer.
So how can philosophy join the conversation? How can non-professionals, philosophers, armchair philosophers, I don't know, people who just enjoy thinking, come in?
Yes, come in. No, I mean, I don't believe that research is done in isolation. You know, you don't sit behind your computer screen and in your desk, and you know all the ideas come to you from wherever. Research is very much done in discussing with other people, in interacting, in forming research groups. This is how the natural sciences work. You know, you never find one person working on his or her own. They all work in groups. It's the way how it's also organized. You have labs with research groups. You have you join research groups. There are social norms. You know how you join this group, what credit you get for doing what, etc. You know, you can. This is what we study in STS also. So you're never doing anything on your own. And if you look, for instance, what mathematicians do, mathematicians are an interesting group of people because they are very mobile and they travel around the world constantly visiting a particular colleague. And then they stand together in a room like this with a blackboard and they discuss writing things on the blackboard. Then the colleague comes and writes something else on the blackboard and they discuss what they write on the blackboard. And you know, from an STS perspective, there are even some movies, videos that are being made. You know, what does the first mathematician write? What does the second one write? How do they discuss? So, you know, we know. And this somehow is the nature, you know, discuss with each other. It helps you to refine your research question. It helps you to refine whether it's the right method or not, etc. And, you know, bring in people from a different perspective also. And I think philosophers are welcome to join. And from this point of view, I think that's the skill that you bring to it. You can ask questions that no one else asked in this particular way.
Yes, I think Helga has made a very important point here. I think it's in the interaction and the crossroads between the traditional disciplines that we find most exciting ideas being pursued for present and future research. So philosophy definitely will come into that formula. And has provided a lot, because for me, philosophy is best at asking fundamental questions and asking questions about our methodologies, about whether we're going in the right direction in looking for answers to questions. So, for example, Husserl's philosophy has given great impetus to psychology, you know, some varieties of psychology and sociology, which are empirical, of course, you know, whereas philosophy, pure philosophy anyway, is kind of non-empirical, but actually it's of course based on empirical experience. You can't get away from that. You can't think without that, right? But to pursue these ideas further, you need the empirical work, which then you then do in psychology and sociology, in linguistics and so on. So Wittgenstein is another example. He just thinks about language without too much empirical work, but his thinking about language is so sharp that nowadays in pursuing linguistic research, which is empirical, we need to go back to Wittgenstein to understand what we're doing. Sometimes we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing? Are we doing the reasonable thing, you know, or are we going down the wrong direction? And the philosophers, the best philosophers, will remind us to be careful where we're going.
Thank you so much. That was really intriguing, and I really love the quotation that it's education at the end of the day that will save us from catastrophe. So I'm curious, from your perspective, education, what do you think is most important for people, human beings, to be educated in to define us as humans?
Well, I think we have to think much more how to introduce and to cultivate what I would call critical thinking in education. And we need critical thinking for in this context, for one particular reason. Because, you know, machines, we think of machines replacing humans. Now, in a factory, an automated factory, you can say, you know, you enter here and you have one part of the production process that is completely automated. But you need still people before the automation starts, and you need still people to tell you what happens afterwards. And so, in my view, what is most important are the interaction, the interfaces between machine and human. Now, in a hospital setting, this is different from a factory. It's different in a university or in a research lab. But to focus on these interfaces, we face the question, you know, when do you trust the machine, and the machine can be better in diagnosing, and the machine can be faster. In any case, it's faster than you, but it can be better in certain tasks. But then comes the moment when you have to say, well, wait a moment. We don't want the machine now. It has given us all the data, all the patterns. Let's say you look at, you know, a lung cancer, where the machine is better than the human pathologist. But then you always have a gray zone. And then you have to say, okay, now I stop and I leave the decision, the interpretation of these dubious cases. I leave it up to the human to interpret it, and I don't rely on the machine. You have other examples. In the US, you may have heard, they want to have this criminal profiling. So you want to know ahead who will become a criminal, etc., etc. We know how many mistakes occur, and if you happen to be in the machine, although you are innocent, there's practically no way of you to get out anymore. Yeah? It's a nightmare, because it could happen to any one of us. Yeah? So you have to build in these points where you say, okay, now we stop, and we need a human to interpret and to judge in terms of decisions. You know, should this person go on parole, or should this person, you know, be arrested? Whatever it is. And in order to do this, you have to have the ability to think critically. And this means, when can you trust the machine, when can you rely on the machine, and when you have to say, no, now it needs human. And you have to bring a certain competence with it. And this has to be, I mean, education, the earlier you start, the better. And not to have this blind trust just because you see a number. To put it in a simplistic way, you know, the number must be right. If you don't know where the number comes from, if you don't know how the data have been generated, if you don't know the sources of the data, and this is what we try now to educate children, to make them more media savvy, you know, to guard them from fake news, etc. You know, tell them there are ways, at least, where you can think about the source, try out to find the source. Can you trust this or not? Just as we educate children whom to trust as an adult, you know, in the life of every parent comes the moment when you say, You know, do I let my child out on the street? At the same time, you want to protect them, and you give them some guidelines. You know, when a stranger approaches you, how do you react? So you have to tell this to your child. Yeah? And in a similar way, you know, we have to educate children. What can you trust in terms of numbers and what you see? There was another question there, yes.
Yeah. Hello. I would like to focus on the idea of the digital divide that you just mentioned. And I was reading the news this week about Davos and Jack Ma, who explained that the digital divide might lead to a world war between the countries that are more digitalized and the less digitalized countries. I would like to know what is your perspective on that regard. And also, I would like to bring back a question that you mentioned in the former day back in December about ethical issues related to DNA and the cloning of 2 human beings in Shenzhen. And now several monkeys have been modified to be mentally ill and so on. I would like to know, and that's also a part of the role of philosophy. Where is the limit? Is there a limit? Are we allowed to surpass the limit? Because I see that with the human, you know, with the 2 clones, everybody was mentioning, but no one said, "Shh, stop, this is not good."
No, that's not true. That's not true.
Has it been stopped?
The scientific community was unanimous. They were horrified by what this Dr. Hay did, because apparently this was not properly screened, etc. And this is not the way how you do scientific research if you have a reputation to guard. So no, there was an outcry, and I think even the hospital that deployed him now has dismissed him. So this should not be done. You always have people in every part of life who do not follow the rules, who do not follow the law. So this can happen. But there was a very, very strong reaction. Now, in terms of, you know, ethical guidelines, the scientific community is very much aware of it because there's so much at stake, you know, trying to upgrade, rework guidelines, because whatever guidelines you set up, or even legal regulations that you set up, they are lagging behind scientific research. There's a time lag that you cannot overcome because research is first. And you cannot just say we forbid everything. So you have constantly, you know, to negotiate how far can you go, under which conditions, and there are better and worse ways of doing it. Now, one way how it was done in the UK, and I think this is a very interesting way, they set up the Human Fertility and Authority, and rather than saying in general, you know, we allow this was about the 3-parent producing children in a test tube with 3 parents, because the 2 parents, one has a genetic defect that can be overcome by including the genetic material of the 3rd parent. Now, instead of saying, you know, in general we allow this or we forbid it, they say, you know, you come to us and we decide on a case-by-case basis. And I think this has a number of advantages, because you can say, you know, this is a family that desperately, you know, wants a child and has a history of trying everything, did not work, etc. We know, etc. So it allows you on a case-by-case basis to try out things before coming out with it. And then if you have enough cases, first of all, you know these are very few cases, or the problem is more widespread than everyone had thought. And then eventually you come up with a legal regulation, you know, that applies to everyone. So I think that's a good way forward. There may be other good ways forward, but it means also you have to have trust in the judgment of the people who decide. It's not about lawyers fighting with each other or a court. And believe me, the judges know nothing about genomic research, but they don't have to. But to have competent people, and you give them also, the freedom, and you empower them to say, you are the experts in this field, and you decide, but on a case-by-case basis. And your first question was the divide. Well, I think there is much more of a digital divide in every country than between countries. You can say maybe even one hunger-stricken and conflict-ridden country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, is perhaps digitally not very advanced. Nevertheless, also in these places, you have some people who are digitally at the same standard as the rest of the world, and they will become more. So I don't think it will be between, but within each country, you do have digital divides. And that's a question how to deal with them. In Singapore, you will deal with it in a different way than in India or as it happens in the US. Every country has the problem. So we have one more question?
Yeah, one last question maybe.
Yeah.
I'll make it quick. Don't get speaking too high.
Because you've already asked one, right?
No, both. No,
both, okay.
Okay, I'll put it real quick. Hi, Dr. Nowotny. My name is Chin. I'm from the School of Humanities. I'm doing translation studies. But my question has nothing to do with language, but rather about the social contract between governments and its citizens. As you mentioned during your answering of the last few questions, that there is a digital divide. And during the first, second, and third industrial revolutions, it feels like the fourth industrial revolution is penetrating our lives so much more, personally. And it feels like it's no longer going to be a dog-eat-dog world, it's going to be a machine-eat-machine world, being like God made humans as a machine. Our bodies are the most intricate machines there can be. So should the governments honor their social contract to their citizens, so to say, by closing the divide? By giving them skills to meet the future, as you say?
Well, I don't know how God created humans, but the metaphor of the machine is a metaphor you may use today. In previous times, people would not have thought that the body is a machine. Rather, you would have thought, it's a plant. And the metaphor was the other way around. The country, a state, a government was thought to be an organ, something organic, like a body, yeah? So, we shift our metaphors, and so this is just a remark, but to your question, what the government should do, any government that realizes and is willing and capable of doing something about it, you have to start as early as possible in educating the children, but you also have to reach out to disadvantaged groups and try to bring them in with a technology that they can become familiar with and help them and show them that they can also do productive things with it. One example that it's not a precise answer, but in a country like India, where you still have a very high illiteracy rate, when the mobile phones were introduced, and by the way, India has more mobile phones than they have toilets. Yeah? But what no, I mean it's a known fact, and it's something that really makes you think of where we are in terms of human development on this planet. And what happened is the ingenious use that, for instance, fishermen made with their mobile phone. they had to sell their fish right away because you don't have refrigerators, etc., etc. So you have a few hours, you come back with your catch, you have to sell your fish. How do you sell your fish? You have in the old days you had middlemen, and they were setting the prices. So you had to go to the middleman, and he said, well, you know, today the restaurants don't want so much, so you get a lower price. And I pay you only so much for it. And this changed the moment they had mobile phones, because then they were able to relate through the mobile phone directly to the buyers, and you know, networks were set up. And so it's just one example of many, how people who don't know how to read, they don't know how to write, but they know when they are cheated, you know, and they want to get the best price for themselves in their conditions, are able to use, let's call it modern technology. And something similar happens. So you have to find out where does it really help people and how can you empower them to use this technology to the best of their advantage. And there's a lot of, we are back to, you know, empirical research that needs to be done on the ground, discussing, finding out what is the situation with the people now, what do they complain about, and well, they complain about many things, but where are the complaints really something that the government has to listen to and has to do and can do something about it. Thank you. And then,
okay, last question.
I'll try to keep this very short. Thanks so much for the fascinating talk. This question relates with your background in STS. My brief understanding of STS comes from Latour, Wuger, Mauke, who tried to... Latour? Latour,
yes.
Wuger, Mauke, and several others who try to deconstruct knowledge claims or what we perceive as scientific breakthroughs as something that's socially constructed. And I think one of the questions that I grapple with is that how do we account for how some knowledge claims are more valued and are more valid, seen as more valid than others? And this is especially important now in this post-truth era, especially when Trump and company denies that there's climate change or that there's such a thing as global warming. It seems as though it's turned against scholars who try to explain how knowledge claims can actually be socially constructed. It's become used in this sort of discourse. So perhaps you might have some thoughts or responses to this kind of...
Yeah, well, the question about knowledge claims is still a valid question, and STS scholars continue to look into that. And the way how what to do with the fake news and the claims experts have only opinions, etc., it's actually much wider, but it also concerns the STS community, of course. And it is perhaps easier to say how scientists and experts should not react. And they should not react by putting themselves at the same level of argumentation. So if you say only we know the facts, you remain in your elite corner and you will not get out of it, and your credibility will not be enhanced. First of all, facts are not written in stone, but facts have been made. This is the original Latin root of the word factum, has been made. And you have to understand how facts are being made. Now, facts are not truth, and certainly not in the philosophical sense of truth. And scientists don't speak about truth. They speak about does it work, does it not work? You know, is it up to what we know today? There's a scientific consensus. And the scientific consensus at every moment in time is a preliminary one, because we know there will be new knowledge coming, there will be, that will cover more in a better sense, etc. So we are building on the facts and the knowledge of yesterday. And tomorrow's knowledge will go a bit further than what we know today. Now, within the scientific communities, you have certain mechanisms to judge, you know, the validity, etc. This is why we have peer review. It's not perfect. It has its flaws. We know that, but so far we have not come up with something better. But by and large, you know, I would say even in some spectacular cases it takes a bit longer, but the scientific community has been able to deal with misconduct, it has been able to deal with fraud, it has been fraud as a deliberate fabrication of wrong data. Now, this is part of the imperfection that exists, and everyone should admit it. But by and large, you know, the scientific consensus mechanism is very strong in weeding out, in differentiating what does not stand the criteria of evidence, the criteria of proof, which varies from field to field. It's not just one proof that you can say is the same in, you know, linguistics, in I don't know, physiology, epidemiology, physics, whatever. So you have to know, you know, what are the, so you go back to the scientific community, and they are the ones that have a social mechanism of working together, and they have to control each other.
And maybe that's where education also comes into it, you know, the critical mindset that can come into these situations where there are different knowledge claims and different claims to the truth. That's when criticality comes into it. And that's where education will help us avoid catastrophes. Okay, thank you very much, Helga.